So if I can ask you to take your seats, we are now like to welcome you to the first concurrent session. Just make sure you're in the right place. This is a session which is going to be two contributions associated with resource use efficiency and issues of sustainability. My name is Ian Croot. I'm the Chief Scientist of the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board here in the UK, of which, of course, the Potato Council is a component, and it's my pleasure to chair the session and introduce two excellent speakers. So as you take your seats, our first speaker, we're really delighted that we were able to secure Dr. Colin Chartres, who has come to us from the International Water Management Institute in Sri Lanka, where he's been Director General for some years, a real expert in the whole area of water use management and sustainability. And the morning will be two presentations. I hope that speakers will leave enough time for some questions between presentations, and we finish about an hour from now, about half an hour for each of these two presentations, hopefully with some time for questions thereafter. So Colin, if I can come and ask you to come and talk to us about securing water supplies for agriculture.
Well, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you very much to the Congress for inviting me. Like Sir John Beddington, I'm confronted with a lot of people who know much, much more about potatoes than I do, so you'll have to forgive me that I'm coming at some of the issues here from very much a natural resources point of view. But I will try and make it specific for potatoes where I can. I'd also like to acknowledge particularly some of the latter work here that has been done by one of my colleagues, Aditya Sood, the modelling you'll see later on. What I want to talk about broadly food security and the relationship between food and water food security and water scarcity. I want to give you a brief feel for what are the real drivers of changing water demands globally. Particularly looking at population, and then economic factors of development, and again this was something that John mentioned early on, and then take you through some modelling that we've been doing recently, where we've been revisiting what's called the comprehensive assessment of water management in agriculture to see if things have changed in the sort of 10 or so years since the work for that significant publication was done. It was published in 2007, but related very much to about the period of 2000, the year of 2000 before. And then come back to this paradox of producing more food with less water, which again was mentioned by the keynote speaker this morning. And briefly, my simplistic interpretation of what potato farmers' responses should be in the potato industry, but I'm sure you can make much better conclusions than I can. If we look at what's been happening over the last 100 years or so, we see some pretty significant increases in population of about 3.6 times. But what has been really even more significant than that is that GDP, gross domestic product, has increased about 19 times, about 3% per year, if you take this at constant prices. This is a really critical figure, because if it continues like this, it's going to increase the numbers in the middle classes, and that will have a very big impact on demand for water from all uses, but in particular from domestic and from urban and industrial uses, and put even more pressure onto agriculture. During that time, water withdrawals have increased about 6.8 times, and that whether or not you believe the GDP or the population is unsustainable, I'm pretty sure that increasing water withdrawals at that same rate is going to be unsustainable. And if we just have a look at where some of this population dynamics is or are, In particular, there's a little bit less emphasis there on East Asia. You can see the increasing focus around cities in Eastern Asia, but you can see this tremendous increase in the last 10 years of population in South Asia, in particular in India, in the Ganges. And then again, if we look in Africa, I haven't got a slide for that, we'll see a very, very similar sort of increase in population of probably 100 to 200%. I can't remember the precise figures, but a real challenge for everyone to deal with in terms of both food and water. And it's going to be very country and region specific. As we saw earlier, there will be no change in most of Europe, little change in North America, but some quite significant changes in particularly in Asia and Africa. And what does this mean in terms of agriculture in general? Well, it means the amount of water and the amount of land there is per person is continually going to decrease. If we look on the left, we see there a number of Asian countries showing quite significant declines for land. If we look at just one example, Indonesia, this green line here, we're seeing going from 0.7 hectares per person down to about 0.3 or thereabouts over the last, I think this was over the last 50 or so years. And similarly, water, we see again this declining amounts of water availability in thousands of cubic meters per person, decreasing on an annual basis. If we bear in mind that availability of about 1,000 cubic meters is the threshold for water per person that the UN suggests is going to lead us into a sustainable future, we have got a number of worries in a number of significant countries in that region, but elsewhere around the world. If we look globally then at what's happening in terms of water scarcity, this is some work which was done about 8 or 9 years ago by my colleagues at EMI, and it shows those areas of the world in the sort of orangey brown colours in through here, and noting southwest US, California, and southeastern Australia, parts of southern Africa, etc., where there is physical water scarcity. By that we mean that about more than 75% of the total available water resources have already been utilised. And if we bear in mind that we need some water for environmental flows and environmental reasons, these countries are all reaching fairly stressed situations in terms of their availability of water. And for example, where I come from in southeast Australia, there is a very, very major debate going on about how much water in the Murray-Darling Basin should be conserved for the environment versus how much should be allowed to go into agriculture and other uses. There are also a number of countries, and perhaps this is quite fortunate for Africa, where there is not as yet this same degree of physical water scarcity. There often is plenty of water, but there hasn't been the investment in developing those resources in terms of infrastructure, either for agriculture or for industry, or in many cases for domestic users. So there is some potential for developing further water resources there. But bear in mind, and again Sir John alluded to this morning, that we basically have on the planet now the same amount of fresh water that was there when the Earth was created. We are not creating more water, although we can produce sources of new water by desalination and other techniques, but these are extremely expensive and in many cases, except perhaps in very rich Middle Eastern countries, beyond the thrall of traditional agricultural users. I did have a quick look at where global potato cultivation is taking place, and I was quite amazed to see the very high figures in China that we heard about this morning. I think 74 million tonnes, and Pamela Anderson was telling me that's forecast to double, and that is one of those areas where there is already quite significant physical water scarcity. And again, that's just a close-up. But again, something which struck me there is the proportion of dots in the Ganges itself, again, where we've got this tremendously high rate of population growth. So if we look at overall drivers of food and water scarcity, clearly the first and foremost in the next 20 to 40 years is going to be population growth. We're going from a population of 7 billion today to 9 billion, mainly in those areas that I highlighted, and those figures have a fairly high degree of uncertainty. They could be higher, they might be a little bit lower. Dietary change is a major issue, as is urbanisation, with cities wanting to take more of the water for industry, for domestic users, and also having the clout and the money and the political ability to often take that water from agriculture, either by purchasing it or just literally appropriating it. Globalisation issues have made quite significant changes to where we get our products, where food is produced and so on, and are things that we need to take into account. Over the last few years we've seen significant amounts of biofuel production mandated by many governments, often up to 15%, and these biofuels are often competing for land and water with land and water resources that were going into agriculture, and climate change. And I'll come back to each one of those in a moment. Just to sort of look at diets, this is the way that meat consumption has increased per capita in China and India. India is not rising the same degree as China because of the predominantly vegetarian diet there. But if we look at dairy, we see India climbing very, very rapidly. And the key point is that both meat and milk require a lot more water to produce than do most cereals and most vegetables. And if we take this to its logical extreme and project out of what is happening, this is some work by McKinsey's for India, which was based actually on IMI and IFPRI data, which showed that the 2030 supply in billions of cubic metres is about 750, and that with a growing demand of about 2.8%, we will see that India will have a gap between supply and demand for the whole subcontinent of about 50% by 2030, something which is creating considerable concern already at political and other levels in India, and promoting things such as vast national river linking schemes, which are very expensive, environmentally damaging, when there may be other cheaper solutions. So the drivers paint a pessimistic picture, even without climate change. Some figures here: food production has got to increase by 70% to feed everybody. That's going to require up to 6,000 cubic kilometres of water. We've got climate change to contend with. We may reduce yields in many areas by 30%. And temperature increase will certainly have a big impact on many crops in many continents, even if CO2 in optimum areas does lift production of some crops. So what I wanted to go through in the second part of this talk is to look at some projections that we've developed, and scenarios developed using some modelling, using similar models which were run a few years ago by both IMI and by the Food Policy Research Institute in Washington. And we use WaterSim, which has both a physical component and an economic food supply component. We've run it for 125 river basins and 115 economic areas, and we've looked at scenarios as well where trade was enhanced over 2010 levels. I'm only going to give you a snapshot of what the results show, but if we look at this change in GDP, of those, we looked at 3 scenarios, but this was a high population growth rate scenario. And we then looked at a business as usual scenario and then an optimistic scenario. So you can see under this optimistic scenario, where people are getting richer, some very significant increases in certain countries, particularly in Africa and parts of Asia, which will create growing demand for food and water. Population growth may be slowing as well, and that's a benefit. Again, this is a pessimistic scenario with high population growth, highlighting the problems in the subcontinent and Africa. If we go to this business as usual, roughly similar, but going to an optimistic scenario, population growth slowing down. So we've used those three scenarios to really sort of run this model through a number of different options. And I have looked at what happened in terms of a large number of commodities. We've just highlighted potatoes there. And one of the things that we're projecting in this modelling is that obviously to feed this growing number of people, demand is going to increase quite significantly over the next 40 or so years, and you can see there something like 30 to 40% increasing demand for potatoes. What the model also looks at and builds into it is that if we are increasing demand in that magnitude and the markets are good, the prices are going to go up, and this is the projection. The model deals with that, and this shows projected increases in prices for potatoes compared with 2010, a 200+% increase there, and very similar figures you can see there for a range of other commodity crops. This increase in price and increase in demand has a feedback in the model in that we would see this leading to increased yields, increased productivity because of these increasing demands. I want to show here just briefly then what this means in terms of water demand at the regional level. These regions are Africa, Middle East, North Africa, East Asia and the Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. And you can see that if we look at the optimistic scenario, which is the one with the high GDP, consumptive water demand is growing very, very rapidly, and in particular, it varies in different parts of the world. Under a pessimistic scenario with high population growth but low GDP, population doesn't increase as water demand doesn't increase as rapidly. And then if we look at this by sector, we're still working on these figures, though they may be a little bit inaccurate, but what we're showing is that the model allocates water first to urban and to industry and leaves what's left to agriculture. So we see as we move forward through the next 30 or 40 years, particularly under the optimistic scenario, the share of water for agriculture is not increasing, but the overall demand is increasing very, very significantly. And to put that in context, we now know that around about at the current day, total what's called blue water, that's irrigated water withdrawals, are something in the order of probably under 4,000 cubic kilometres, and for agriculture probably something over 2,500 cubic kilometres. That range of data shows that these are projections showing that people originally thought it was going to go much higher, but projections are decreasing, probably as we see increasing efficiency. So what I've done here is for two scenarios where we have trade at current levels, 2010 levels on the left-hand side versus an enhanced trading situation, I've plotted a very slowly increasing availability of water with withdrawals from blue water. That's to take into account some sources that have not been developed from groundwater and in areas in Africa. And I don't know how accurate that is, but it clearly shows that even where we can enhance trade and bring goods and commodities from areas where there is plenty of water to those without, by about 2040 to 2050, we certainly hit the wall in terms of demand being greater than supply. And that mirrors what McKinsey showed in India, where they brought that date forward to 2030. So we have to ask ourselves, well, where is all the extra production going to come from if these scenarios are correct, and particularly the optimistic one with the high GDP growth? Well, again, looking at enhanced trade and trade at 2010 levels, I've looked at two things here. How much more green water, that is rain-fed agriculture, resources will be needed, and they are increasing significantly where we don't have much enhancement in trade, and very slightly where there is enhanced trade. And then looking at area expansion, again, if we are to meet those scenarios at 2010 trade levels, we've got to not only grow more in rain-fed areas we've also got to increase the area of land being used. And again, as we've heard earlier, this is going to be a challenge. There are only a few areas in the world where we can both increase the land area and probably, in particular, and if we're going to increase the green water use, we've got to increase efficiency. We've looked as well at climate change, and I just want to point out one thing here, and again it mirrors what Sir John was saying earlier on. This was using a couple of the IPC scenarios, and with rainfall it is extremely variable, and there's not a lot of trend there. But with temperature, which has less uncertainty associated with it in the IPCC models, we can see this increasing trend of higher temperatures, which mean more evapotranspiration and therefore more demand for irrigation. So quite a significant change there in terms of demand for water on top of what I've shown you already before, somewhere between 14 and 17%. So coming to some solutions, how are we going to deal with this? We clearly have a paradox. That is feeding the 2 billion more people with less water for agriculture because of the increasing demand from the other sectors than we have now, and in an era of climate change. There are a lot of things we can do. Unfortunately, none of this is really rocket science. Some of it will stem, and I haven't touched on here, around breeding of new varieties, GM and normal route pathways to that, and that will certainly be part of the solution. But in particular, we can reduce waste. We waste an awful lot of food, both at the farm gate and at the point of consumption. For example, in 2010, I think that's an EU figure, we threw away 179 kilograms per person per year. That's a phenomenal amount of food. If we can reduce, and it's shown here in terms of how much that would look like in your annual shopping sort of basket. But if we can reduce loss and waste by 50%, that's an equivalent to a rise in output of 15 to 25%. I'll come back to that point a little bit later. We can encourage trade in terms of growing commodities that need a lot of water in areas where there is a lot of water, and using scarce water resources in other areas to add value to other areas of production, industry, urban, domestic, or very high value local horticulture and agriculture and so on. But again, we know that we don't operate in a perfect world in terms of trade, and we have a number of problems, such as, for example, in 2008 in the food crisis, when we saw certain countries just close their borders to exports when they could have, when they had good reasons why they should have been exporting. So again, this is something for the sort of geopolitics to consider in terms of overall long-term food security at global levels. We can increase productivity, and here there is some very encouraging data taken from a number of countries that we've recently been looking at. If these lines are going vertical, it's showing that productivity in terms of cereal production per unit area is increasing, and there's no increase of land. So if you look at all the vertical lines, big success stories, particularly China, which I think is this line here, no increase in land, but productivity increasing dramatically. Compare that with Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, where the only way production is increasing at the moment has largely been through expanding the area of land. This just cannot happen in the long term. Africa has to go up vertically to sort of match supply with demand, or demand with supply. I mentioned here reducing consumption. This was on the previous slide, I realise, but the key point here is if we can reduce by about 50% losses of food, we will get potential water savings of about 1,350 cubic kilometres. That's a phenomenal amount of water that we don't have to find elsewhere. But this is going to require tremendous education and capacity building outside the realms of the scientists and the farmers involved. It's going to require every consumer to understand the importance of saving food. So we can, if we take a number of these strategies, there certainly are a lot of ways that we can reduce water demand. And if we look at where we are today there, this is from the comprehensive assessment in terms of adding green and blue water. Yeah, we're using about, just for agriculture, about 7,000 cubic kilometres. If we go to no productivity, business as usual, we will end up with about 13,000 cubic kilometres. Now, there just isn't that amount of water, as far as we can see, going to be available to increase production. So it does mean we've definitely got to look at some of these productivity gains. If we take this CA scenario, and I haven't had time to go through our new modelling other than on the back of an envelope, but it seems to be coming up with about the figure of 8,000 to 9,000 cubic kilometres of green and blue water. We can actually reduce this figure of 13 down to 8 or 9. And again, that's going to be by a little bit of increase in irrigation, but also by increasing the productivity rather than the aerial expansion of many rain-fed systems. So this, in a way, is a target, an aspirational target that we've all got to be thinking about. It's hard talking to many farmers from Western countries when they are close to potential yield targets, but it's something we've got to do in the development world to really help colleagues in those environments really lift productivity up to the levels that we see in the West. So, by way of conclusion, as I said earlier, I just wanted to sort of ask some questions or suggest some things that this may mean for potato farmers. But again, I'm sure the potato industry has been thinking about this and has a lot of much better ideas than I have. Certainly then, there's a healthy future in my view for the potato commodity industry because of this increasing demand. It is, however, going to have to meet that demand by becoming increasingly productive and efficient with the use of both its rain-fed agricultural system and where there's irrigation with irrigation water, because the competition for that irrigation water and even sometimes for the green water from water catchment for urban supply is going to become greater almost everywhere. As we've seen earlier, cultivation areas may have to shift due to heat and water stress issues associated with climate change. Disease may also come into play. Water may get more expensive. This is a very difficult concept. Many countries consider that water is God's gift. And even in many Western countries, we only pay for the infrastructure to deliver it, a service charge. But certainly in some countries, in Australia and even in India now, we're seeing water markets being established where water is moving from low-value users to high-value users. This may not be a bad thing. It will increase a move towards efficiency, but it means each industry is going to be competing strongly, and to survive will have to become increasingly efficient and more productive in terms of more crop per drop of water. What we're showing here is that the modelling that we've used is making the assumption that demand and prices will trigger productivity increases and greater efficiency. That's usually the case, but we also need to make sure that we put in place the support structures so that that can happen in many of the developing countries that we're working in. We may have to use more treated water, and again that has some public health considerations, but it can be done safely, as has been shown in many studies. And first and foremost, it means that we've got to sustainably intensify agriculture without expanding agriculture. And that's going to have big implications in terms of environments and ecosystems. And that's something we really need to spend a lot of time and attention on, working out how we can intensify agriculture in harmony with the environment, so we're not polluting the environment with a lot of runoff from fertilisers, erosion and so on. And there's an awful lot of work that can still be done in that particular area. So with that, I've given you a very quick run through some of the projections. I hope it's not all doom and gloom. I think there are a lot of simple solutions we can put in place, but it does mean we all need to be waking up to some of these critical concerns around food and water. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. We still have a couple of minutes for questions. If anybody has anything that they would like to ask Colin. Yes, please.
Cedric Porter from World Potato Markets. What areas of the world do you see the greatest potential for extra production in water resources?
I think there's often a lot of talk about building capacity and production in parts of the old USSR, Ukraine and those areas. I think, again, as climate change probably shifts climate zones a little bit farther north, that will apply. There are pockets of Africa and parts of Angola, I believe, where there are quite good soils and water still available. Little bits of South America. And again, I guess if climate change bites as hard as we expect it may, parts of Canada might be able to sort of increase production. But don't forget, as that happens, often we're shifting everything north or potentially south. So it's a double-edged sword in that sense.
One more? I'll take this gentleman in the front. Thank you.
It's a simple question. Do you think the question will be for African country as the following: which crop, which variety, which agricultural practices that lead to the highest quantity of food per water unit, whatever the crop?
That's a really good question, and
perhaps
I can't.
Just to make sure everybody heard the question, perhaps Colin, just repeat the question slightly, and then.
Well, as I understood it, for many African countries, which food, which crop, which water sources will help them meet this challenge? Is that correct?
Now you have a unit of water.
Yeah, in terms of water productivity.
Which
yeah.
crop, which variety, which agricultural practice that you have, we have to put on to get the maximum food crop.
Well, I'm going to I'm going to answer it in a slightly different way, because we've just been doing some pretty interesting work for the Gates Foundation in Africa, looking at how do we improve agricultural water management, getting this more crop per drop, and most of the answers don't come down to either which region or which, well, not particularly which region, but which specific crop, or how the water is applied. They come down to looking at the whole value chain of agriculture, looking at where the resources and the crops start in the field in terms of the rainfall and the management of that and the irrigation, through to can they get these crops to market? Are the markets there? Can they expand those markets? Is there the capacity building available to help smallholder farmers do that? Are the transport links there? And so on and so on. So I think each region needs to have a very close look at what are its current problems and what are its current opportunities for the specific suite of crops which can be grown there. But look at these value chains, not just the water, not just the crop.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to move on. Colin is here for some of the rest of today, so those that want to pick up with him, hunt him out. I have one announcement that